Thanks, Dan. And I'll be focusing on the educational aspect of the panel for today. Russell Kirk is usually remembered as one of the foremost scholars and writers of the 20th century, and for good reason. Chief among his accomplishments was the publication of The Conservative Mind, which demonstrated that there is a distinctively conservative intellectual tradition in the Anglo-American world. At the time, this was a significant achievement. Only a few years earlier, the literary critic Lionel Trilling had observed that in America, there was only one tradition, the liberal tradition. Conservatives, Trilling thought, lacked coherent and convincing ideas, offering little more than irritable mental gestures. Kirk, however, refuted this view. He showed that serious conservative thought did exist in the Anglo-American tradition. And then, in the years that followed, he went on to write other important works, such as Eliot in His Age, The Roots of American Order, and America's British Culture. In addition to his nonfiction, Kirk was also a gifted writer of ghostly fiction. Books and stories like Old House of Fear and Princess of All Lands were read by many people. As Kirk later put it in The Sword of Imagination, his autobiography, readers began to fancy that there were two scribbling Russell Kirks, one who wrote grave historical and political works and essays for the literary and scholarly journals, and another who wrote Old House of Fear and published uncanny tales. This afternoon, I want to suggest another way in which Kirk should be remembered, not only as a man of letters and fiction writer, but also as one of the 20th century's foremost defenders of liberal education. In particular, I think Kirk should be remembered as an educational thinker who recognized the vital connection between liberal learning and the conservation of a cultural and intellectual inheritance. Kirk's insights on education speak not only to scholars, but also to anyone concerned with how education shapes the character of a people and the future of a civilization. So at its core, Russell Kirk's educational vision was a rearticulation of the liberal arts tradition of Western civilization. This educational tradition had long held that learning was an intellectual means to an ethical end, which he would often repeat from Babbitt. Kirk's own educational vision drew especially from the thought of Edmund Burke, St. John Henry Newman, and Irving Babbitt. Among his contemporaries, he can be compared with writers like T.S. Eliot and Christopher Dawson. And in his educational writings, one thing that Kirk is doing is he's giving us this kind of lineage of conservative minds that inform the way we think about education. So this list of people I just gave can kind of be understood in that way. In contrast to figures like Bentham, Rousseau, Dewey, and other figures that Kirk would often be more critical of. Kirk's concern for the state of liberal education in America can be traced to some of his earliest writings. As far back as 1945, while serving in World War II, he penned an article for the South Atlantic Quarterly in which he defended liberal learning and diagnosed contemporary educational problems. So I'll quote Kirk. "Liberal education frees the mind. It also frees men. Why then have we scoffed and kicked liberal learning of the old school? Perhaps because of our national passion for novelty, new methods, progressive education," he has these in quotes, "that siren song of progress, but progress toward what? We have turned from the classics to the lathe because of our fetishes of creature comfort and material aggrandizement. We have forsworn the old ways because of our love of ease, for true learning is difficult to acquire, and modern studies, from sand pouring to hotel administration, require minimum effort. Our vices have betrayed us, our folly and our sloth have had their way, and now, when we need men of lofty mind, broad views, and stern integrity, we find ourselves a nation enamored of fads, fierce passion, and selfish materialism. As Kirk would later put it, the old tradition of liberal and humanistic studies was under threat, and with it, so was the modern West. Without an authentically liberal and humane education, contemporary civilization, Kirk worried, might not long endure. So again, as he wrote in 1954. Where there is no liberal learning, in the long run, there is no civilization, at least no civilization in our Christian and Western tradition. For some years and even generations after liberal learning has been extinguished in this country or that, the outward signs of civilization may remain, sustained by the dwindling intellectual capital of the generation that is passing, or by the borrowing the thought and moral standards of nations where something of the old grace of life survives. Yet, in the end, the mind of man stifles without the liberating influence of liberal learning, end quote. Convinced of the importance of education in renewing the modern West, Kirk would spend decades defending liberal learning and critiquing the errors of progressive education. After World War II, he taught for a time at Michigan State, but eventually resigned in frustration over the lowering of academic standards and the decline of academic freedom. And he would always call Michigan State Behemoth U as kind of a symbol of this. In 1955, he wrote a book titled Academic Freedom, tracing the roots of academic freedom to classical and Christian sources. In this book, Kirk argued that the freedom of the scholar is an inheritance that is worthy of conservation and a necessary condition for the academy to remain a place that seeks truth and wisdom. In Decadence and Renewal in the Higher Learning, 1978, Kirk provided an episodic history of higher education in America from 1953 to the present day of Kirk's lifetime. Kirk wrote more on the topic of education than any other single subject. He produced hundreds of articles, essays, and newspaper columns, including a regular biweekly column for National Review titled From the Academy, which he wrote for nearly a quarter century. And beyond his writings, he worked tirelessly for educational reform. He lectured widely, served as a visiting professor at numerous universities, advised foundations dedicated to educational renewal, founded a used bookshop, and became the president of the Educational Reviewer and the founding editor of the University Bookman, a quarterly publication devoted in its early issues to serious reviews and essays on education. Throughout his career, Kirk made the case that liberal education and cultural renewal are not peripheral to the conservative cause. They are, in fact, at the very heart of it. And liberal education itself, he showed time and again, is rightly understood as a conservative endeavor. As Kirk once put it, I am declaring that the task of the liberal educator, in essence, is a conservative labor. Kirk added, I am suggesting that colleges and universities ought not be degree mills. They ought to be centers for genuinely humane and genuinely scientific studies, attended by young people of healthy curiosity who actually show some interest in mind and conscience. I am saying that the higher learning is meant to develop order in the soul for the human person's own sake. I am saying that the higher learning is meant to develop order in the commonwealth for the republic's sake. In this sense, liberal education for Kirk embodied the best of the conservative spirit, preserving what is enduring and cultivating wisdom for the good of both the person and society. Now, it's important to make a clarification when we say that Kirk believed that liberal education has a conservative purpose. Because what Kirk is not saying is that we should be introducing constant debates and references to practical politics in the classroom, nor is he turning education into an ideological battleground. For Kirk, conservatism in education meant fostering an appreciation for what he, following T.S. Eliot, called the permanent things, the truths and moral norms that help us transcend the transient battles of partisan politics. A truly liberal education, in Kirk's view, is not about preparing young ideologues for partisan combat. Rather, it is about allowing students to find wisdom and virtue and helping them to appreciate the best of their cultural and intellectual inheritance. This vision of liberal education was most comprehensively expressed in his introduction to Irving Babbitt's Literature in the American College and within the pages of his book, Eliot and His Age. One of Kirk's most enduring educational insights was the formative power of literature and humane letters in shaping what he called the moral imagination, a term that he borrowed from Edmund Burke and Irving Babbitt. In Kirk's view, humane literature helps us to understand what it means to be truly human. Such books help to shape our knowledge of human nature, not through didactic instruction or through sermonizing, but through allegory, metaphor, and poetic insight. In this way, humane literature forms character and helps to order the soul. Modern education, in contrast, had often been starving the moral imagination, replacing it with utilitarianism, ideological slogans, and a concern for relevance. That's like the phrase is this relevance to pop culture. Restoring literature to its central place in education, Kirk believed, was essential to recovering a truly humane civilization. We might put it another way and say that to defend an authentically liberal education is to conserve and renew the best of the Western and Christian traditions, or again, the permanent things that make us truly human. At its best, Kirk showed that education is liberal precisely because it is conservative. It frees souls because it forms them in the best of a cultural and intellectual heritage. It liberates precisely because it hands down to posterity all that is true and good and permanent. It forms leaders in all walks of life who can serve as leaven precisely because they have the wisdom and virtue of the past at their disposal. Such an education binds the rising generation to what Edmund Burke called the eternal society, a communion of souls that includes the living, the dead, and the unborn. And like T.S. Eliot, education for Kirk was the principle of continuity, was an instrument of continuity in a civilization. And like Dawson, he believed that education is the passing down of a culture. So through his writing, editing, and other educational endeavors, Kirk's contribution to the educational arena were great. But the fullest expression of his educational vision can be seen in the work that he and his wife, Annette Kirk, undertook in their home, Piety Hill in Mecosta, Michigan. For decades, thousands of students, scholars, and visitors came to Piety Hill to engage in liberal learning infused with a conservative disposition. Roger Scruton, as we heard earlier today, was himself among such scholars and visitors. Kirk's home and independent library became over time a bastion of liberal education shaped by a conservative cast of mind. Seminars frequently took place where students would gather to learn from Dr. Kirk and other professors. They would enjoy informal conversation and fellowship, as well as hospitality in Kirk's own family house. Through seminars and mentoring, Kirk created a living model of liberal education rooted in tradition, place, and hospitality. In contrast to the utilitarian and ideological tendencies of the modern academy, Kirk's home advanced the kind of liberal studies that link the generations together in the wisdom of the past. For Kirk, it was the task of the 20th century conservative to reawaken the modern world to what it means to be human, and by extension to recenter education on the inner development of the person. Education didn't simply need a few tweaks or adjustments if it was to fend off the decay of humane civilization and human personality, as Kirk put it. In this, the thinking conservative must be radical. He must strike at the roots of this preservation of learning. For in most of our state-sponsored schools nowadays, and probably in the great part of our universities and colleges, the educational process has become inimical to the real human person." End quote. According to this view, what was needed was educational reform and a return to the educational aims that were common before the 20th century, before the rise of the Benthamites and Deweyites in American learning. So these ideas, I believe, are worth recovering today. Kirk isn't usually known as an educational thinker, but he should be. These educational insights can continue to guide us, and the reason is simple: that they are probably some of the most insightful conservative contributions to educational and cultural renewal in America. Such ideas should be recovered and championed again, especially now when education so often forgets its purpose. And in an age when education is often reduced to job training or ideological indoctrination, we need voices that remind us of what liberal studies are really for. And one of those voices, often overlooked, but more needed than ever, is Russell Kirk.
Wonderful.